Hello, I hope you're having a great day. My name is Nathan Brummel, and today in modern church history we look at the life of Herman Bavinck for a second time. In our first episode on him, we looked at his childhood and his parentage. We traced the story of how his father Jan grew up in a German Reformed church and family in Germany. And we also traced the story how in God's remarkable providence, Jan had the door open to pursue the ministry of the Word. Now, in this episode, we follow Bavinck as a young man now. He is in his late teens, and he is of seminary age. In those days, basically, they combined pre-seminary studies and seminary studies at what we would call a seminary or a university. And so Herman Bavinck had now reached the age in which he was going to begin pursuing his studies for the ministry of the Word. There are two leading books that have been prominent in telling the life of Herman Bavinck to an English-speaking audience. The first of them is by Ron Gleason, entitled Herman Bavinck, Pastor, Churchman, Statesman, and Theologian. This book has been on the market for a number of years, and this book is interesting. For example, it will be more detailed at certain points on certain subjects about Bavinck's life than the latest, newest biography of Bavinck. For example, I like how Gleason has a very nice extended dramatic discussion of an event later on in Herman Bavinck's life when he would be trying to convince the Synod of the GKN to approve the unification of the seminary in Kampen along with the Free University, so that the GKN would have one school for theological training. It's very intriguing how he has a lot of detail and tells the story of that. What happened is that the Synod actually approved Bavinck's proposal by 30 to 17, but what happened is that some conservatives in the church from the Afscheiding tradition, especially a man named Thomas Boss, then threatened succession. He told the Synod that if they would go ahead with unifying the theological schools, as Bavinck and Kuyper wanted, that something would happen which all the churches feared and dreaded, and of course that was a schism. And so the first book, if you'd like to begin to learn about the life of Bavinck, would be Ron Gleason's biography on that topic. Now, a recent, more scholarly one is by James Eglinton that has just been recently published in 2020. It's called Bavinck, A Critical Biography. And this book is quite intriguing because especially it follows the life of Bavinck following his Dagboek or his diary. So James Eglinton does a really nice job of following along Bavinck's life, and at critical points having very, very nice and appropriate quotes from his own diary. This book has been quite widely acclaimed, and so it's also a very nice source for learning about Bavinck's life. This is sort of the best biography out there now. For many American Christians, the Reformed dogmatics and the other theological writings of Herman Bavinck have become more well known, without people having necessarily so much of a knowledge of Bavinck as a person. People, in fact, can be more familiar with the life of Abraham Kuyper, since there have been a number of biographies written about him. And so now the American public and Christians in America are being able to learn more about the life of Herman Bavinck. Now, in part one of our talk about the life of Herman Bavinck, we followed the story of his grandfather and then the story of his father, Jan, and how he ended up becoming a minister in the succession churches. And we also discussed how Bavinck had received very excellent education for his age. That was far above par for what most students in the Netherlands would have received at that time. And then Herman Bavinck had graduated from the gymnasium in Zwolle, which we would sort of view as a high school. And so he was ready to attend seminary. And the question is, where would he go? Now, what happens is that Bavinck is going to end up moving just a little bit to the west, just several miles to the west, to live in the city of Kampen, because his dad, Jan, had taken a call to the city of Kampen. Now, years before, his dad had had the opportunity to move to Kampen because he had received an appointment to the seminary, but his faith was too weak, and so he had turned that down. And so, but now, finally, Jan is in Kampen, but as the preacher. He's the main preacher at the church where the faculty at the seminary attend and where many of the seminary students attend. So it's very, very prestigious pulpit, very important. He's modeling what preaching should be like for seminary students. Kampen, of course, is where the Succeder Seminary is located. And this seminary was very close to the hearts of the saints in the Afscheiding. They had supported it so sacrificially. Many of their pastors had now attended there. And for any normal ministerial student in the Afscheiding churches, there would be no question about where he would attend seminary. Of course, he would go to Kampen. Yet our young scholar had received a very high-quality academic education, and he had arrived at his young age at the conclusion that he wanted a higher quality theological education than he could receive at Kampen. Bavinck no doubt shared this very sensitive idea with his father, since his father was the leading pastor in Kampen. In the church that was attended by the professors and the seminary students, you can only imagine the sensitivity of this matter, and it was sensitive. After all, Leiden University, for example, where Bavinck wanted to attend, was a center of theological liberalism and apostasy. Well, we now follow the story of the teenage Bavinck, who really knew his own mind. He faced a decision which really was the sort of a decision an adult would face, and he makes a decision that he wants to pursue his studies at Leiden University instead. Even though the whole time, what's very interesting is that from the very beginning of this whole process, technically, Herman Bavinck is a student at Kampen. So that's very interesting. He's technically a student at Kampen, even though he's going to go off to Leiden University and basically have his theological instruction there. Now, Herman Bavinck moved back home with his dad and mom in Kampen. He had been away from the family home while he had attended the gymnasium, and apparently his dad and mom wanted him back home again, and that's understandable. They were a very close, loving family, and it had been rough, no doubt, for them to be away from their gifted teenage son, and it must have been hard for him to be away from dad, mom, and his siblings. And so instead of him directly going to Leiden after he finished his gymnasium education in Zwolle, instead what he does is he moves to nearby Kampen and moves back with his dad and mom and his siblings. We're not told exactly why that was the case. I have no doubt it's because the family wanted to be together. And so Bavinck gets an opportunity to be back in the family home. Now, the conclusion of his studies at the gymnasium were a triumph for him academically. He graduated at the top of his class in Latin, Greek, French, and Dutch. Following that graduation, he moved back home to Kampen, and the strange thing here is that he's living in Kampen for a year, and he's not even attending classes at the seminary, even though technically he's a student there. Well, he felt a call to the ministry of the word, though, and clearly that was the direction he was going to go. And he moved to Kampen with the plan of beginning his preparation for the ministry. Now, Jan Bavinck had a very influential pastorate. He was an example of what a good pastor should be for the seminary students. He was basically a colleague of the seminary professors. And what was going on for Herman Bavinck is that attending the seminary involved two stages. First, you would take what we would call almost like pre-seminary classes, general studies classes. These were the sort of things to prepare a student for the actual biblical and theological studies in the seminary. So the assumption is that a liberal arts education was necessary in some sense to prepare a student for their theological and ministerial studies. And then what would happen is that when you would finish these preparatory classes, you needed to take what was called a literary exam. So Bavinck is in that status. He hasn't taken his literary exam yet. Now, I think he probably could have just gone ahead at this point and done that. But for whatever reason, he didn't. He would later on, he would come back from Leiden and he would sit for this exam and he would pass it. But for now, he was simply in town and he was technically registered as a student in Kampen, as a ministerial student in the succession churches. So Bavinck here was registered on September 17 of 1873 as a student in Kampen. And from that point on, technically, he would be a student in the Afscheiding Seminary. But he showed absolutely no interest in attending the general education classes with the other students. For him, these classes were simply redundant. And I think that he probably thought that the professors were even less gifted than the ones he had already had. He had studied these subjects and had mastered them already in Zwolle. On the other hand, many of the other brand new seminary students lacked a classical education. Therefore, they needed to have these pre-seminary classes in order to get ready for the challenges they would face in their seminary education. James Eglinton describes the incoming students, and he pretty much tells us that some of them were right off the farm. He says, while 2 of the incoming students had attended either a gymnasium or a Latin school, and 1 had attended a higher burgher school, the majority either had no previous education or had spent a short period studying under a successor minister. The incoming cohort included a baker, a gardener, a number of farm workers, a cooper, a salesman, and 1 student listed simply as having no profession. So Herman Bavinck, no doubt, was not impressed with the quality of the students in Kampen, and also he was nonplussed by the level of teaching at the seminary and by the abilities of the professors. And in fact, as time would go on, even the Synod would come to recognize that there were some serious issues when it came to pedagogy on the part of the professors at the seminary. And later on, they would want to remedy that situation. So Bavinck here, though, you can imagine how this came off. This gifted young man who's quite bright, has done very well at school, isn't coming to class. And it's also an indictment of the professors, which I'm sure some of the professors took a bit to heart, that this young student didn't think it was worth attending class with him or them. And so instead, Bavinck lets everyone know that his plans, in fact, are to study theology at Leiden University. In a brief autobiographical statement that Herman Bavinck wrote later on in his life at the request of someone, he says, "After completing gymnasium, I spent 1 year at the theological school in Kampen, where my father was now a minister. But the education there did not satisfy me. So in 1874, I went to Leiden to study theology under the famous professors Scholten and Kuhnen." Now, that decision was controversial because Kampen was the greatly loved seminary of the succession churches. And these small churches, of course, were very concerned about orthodoxy. Leiden University was where ministers were trained for the state church, after all. And yet, Jan Bavinck supported his son's plans. He realized that his son's heart was in the right place and that he knew that his boy would receive a higher quality academic theological education in Kampen than he could get in Leiden than he could get in Kampen. And even though he knew his son would be studying under liberal, unbelieving theology professors, but he did see the faith and he knew the faith of his son. But certain professors at Kampen, and this isn't so surprising, especially Anthony Brummelkamp, was enraged by Herman's decision. I suppose his pride was hurt, partly by the fact that Herman was critical of the academic level of the teaching there. That's something that Bavinck must have been very aware of. And he was angry at Jan Bavinck for supporting his son in this endeavor. He thought that it even compromised Jan's ability to be a preacher and pastor in Kampen. In fact, when Jan Bavinck would receive a call to another congregation shortly after this, Bavinck would encourage Jan to take the call. What happened is that Jan, showing his indecisive nature, asked the professors in the seminary whether or not he should accept the call away from Kampen or not. The rest of the faculty members, the majority, thought he should stay, but Bavinck thought he should go because he had forfeited basically his right to be a pastor in the church where the seminary was located due to this support of Herman. And so he thought that Jan should have simply forced his son to attend at Kampen. Later on, Herman Bavinck wrote about why he spent a year at home with his parents after his graduation from the gymnasium and then why he attended Leiden University. He says, "It was during the years 1873, 1874, I had completed my gymnasium education and harbored a strong desire to continue my studies at Leiden and become acquainted with modern theology at close quarters. But my parents had only just moved to Kampen and were urging me to come home for at least a year and register as a student at the theological school." And I wonder too if that's partly what his dad wanted, for him to be home where he could at least be registered as a student at the theological school in Kampen. Bavinck goes on to say, "Although I complied with this fully, I nonetheless held on to the desire to take part in a more scientific education than the theological school could offer at that time, and so it was agreed that I would go to Leiden in September of 1874. So he did. Meanwhile, Bavinck, though, spent a year in Kampen, and Eglinton tells us that he found the teaching there in the seminary intellectually uninteresting, so he didn't even attend the general education classes. But what is even more striking is he did not even take the qualifying exams to become a theological student. Maybe he thought at that point that he needed more studying. Eglinton, though, explains Bavinck's status at this time. He says, "At this point, Bavinck's official status at the theological school was still that of a registered student with permission to take the literary exam, following which he would move onward into theological studies." So even though Herman would go off to Leiden University, he always remained a student at the Succession Seminary. 2 years later, while remaining a full-time student at Leiden, he would come back to Kampen, take the literary exam, and would pass it. While he was in Leiden, by the way, he also had to take these pre-seminary type of classes as well. And then after his graduation from Leiden University, Bavinck would submit himself for examination to the trustees of the theological school. That's what they did at the time of graduation. Not the professors, but the trustees would evaluate and examine the students. And then when he got examined by the trustees later on, and they would graduate him, he was then considered a graduate of the seminary in Kampen, even though he had never even studied there. So the theological school recorded Herman as enrolling as student number 281 in 1873. And then the school's records also record him as completing the program in 1880. So this was the route that Bavinck would take into the ministry in the Christian Reformed Church. So he prepared now to study at Leiden University. This controversial decision had made a couple of professors at Kampen unhappy, like Bavinck and Mulder, but other professors there supported him. For example, Professor Hellenius de Kock, who was the son of Hendrik de Kock, supported him. Adrian Stekete did, and Martin Hortzai also supported his plan. There was a growing sense on the part of some in the theological school that there were academic and theological weaknesses in the institution that needed to be overcome, and there was a hope that in the future there could be gifted faculty. And so Herman Bavinck prepares to move to Leiden. It's not like Bavinck was opposed by everyone as he made this decision. For example, in Leiden itself, there were a couple of successor churches, and one successor pastor, the Reverend J.H. Donner, also supported Herman Bavinck's plans. Reverend Donner, I think, was someone who, through his ministry in Leiden, saw the need to reach out to the upper classes, to the more intelligent and educated people in the Netherlands. And therefore, he also supported, I think, Bavinck pursuing his studies at Leiden. In fact, Reverend Donner helped find lodging for Herman. There were two successor churches in Leiden, and the church that Reverend Donner pastored was more educated, and he had a very effective pulpit ministry to them. During this period of time, Herman wrote in his diary, "O God, protect me in Leiden." So this young man is recognizing the spiritual challenges that he's going to face. And after arriving in Leiden, he wrote in his diary on September 23 of 1874 this. He says, "Traveled by boat to Amsterdam with Van de Winter, Persil, Swan, and Limpers, and from there went by train to Leiden. Enjoyable journey, but still boring at the end. Beautiful weather until we arrived in Leiden under a rain cloud. I found saying goodbye to my parents hard, especially because of this. I was going to Leiden. Shall I remain standing? God grant it." In Leiden, the new student had originally planned to join a popular student group on campus. In fact, a large majority of the students were involved with this on-campus group. It would be a way to get to know people and rub shoulders with people. But Bavinck quickly discovered that involvement in this student group would involve drunkenness and partying, and so he decided that he couldn't in good conscience join the student corps. He recorded in his diary, "Began taking part in Freshers' Week, but decided not to become a member of the corps for reasons of conscience." That's cited from Eglinton. All my citations from the Dagboek of Herman Bavinck come from Eglinton's translation of them. At this time, Bavinck had contact with two men who would play a role in shaping Dutch society. The first was Edward Douws Dekker. This man was an atheist who had published books under a very strange pseudonym, Multatuli, and he exposed how the Dutch had mistreated internationals in the Dutch East Indies, but he also was an atheist who wanted to de-Christianize the Netherlands. On the other hand, Bavinck is getting to know Abraham Kuyper personally and is beginning to follow his work in bringing the Reformed faith to bear on church life and political life in the Netherlands. There's also another man who would have a long-term impact on Bavinck as a friend, and that is a fellow student he met in Leiden, a man named Christian Snauk Hergranja. Christian was a theological liberal who would later become a practicing Muslim. He was from an aristocratic background. His father had been a pastor who had then unfortunately committed adultery and run off with a second wife. And even though Bavinck and Christian held to radically different worldviews, they would carry on a long correspondence throughout their lives. For example, Bavinck would send examples of his writings or speeches to Christian for critique and feedback. And Christian, even though he had no sympathy for Bavinck's Christian worldview, would follow his friend's career with great interest. Christian would become an expert on Islam. In fact, he would sneak into Mecca, where he would live as a practicing Muslim. Non-Muslims weren't allowed in the city. He would marry and then abandon a young girl, and then later on in life, he would move to Indonesia, where he married multiple wives and lived under a Muslim name. So Bavinck, anyhow, developed a friendship with Christian. Studying at Leiden was a transition for Bavinck because he was surrounded by unbelief and heresy. Now, prior to focusing on his theological studies, he needed to take classes in general studies at Leiden. And initially, he wasn't so impressed by his students. He also struggled with his faith. In 1876, he wrote in his diary, May 1, back to Leiden. Continuation of study under an attack of doubt, but also with feeling of the inner truth revealed through Christ. Well, it's no wonder that this young man struggled with his faith. He was surrounded by faculty members who were atheistic or were theologically liberal. He was surrounded by people who were being influenced by the spirit of the age. And he was also coming face to face with pretty high quality theological scholarship that was unbelieving. And so it's no wonder that he felt the challenge of theological liberalism and a secular atheistic worldview that was beginning to more and more influence the universities in the Netherlands. It was in July of 1876 that Bavinck took his literary exam back at the theological school in Kampen. There he would have been evaluated by the trustees, and he passed with flying colors. I'm sure that helped him with the trustees and even with the faculty. He could write in his diary on July 11 and 12, "Literary exam in Kampen completed with high praise. Soli Deo Gloria et Gratia." My essay was on the origin and worth of mythology, which I enjoyed indeed and even led to discussion. The trustees of the theological school who judged the pre-seminary students judged that Bavinck had completed the literary exam with distinction. The records of the meeting recorded that H. Bavinck and H. Seipkin shall receive a diploma with noted praise. The remaining 7 shall only receive a normal attestation. Bavinck did record in his diary that after passing his literary exam in Kampen, he said, "Under much external opposition, I went back to Leiden." So once again, notice, there must have been people who thought, okay, now that you've passed your literary exam, you've had a chance to study in Leiden, now won't you study under the orthodox professors here in Kampen? But Bavinck's mind hadn't changed. And so having passed his literary exam so that he could now pursue theological studies in Kampen, if he wanted, he still continued to study under the professors in Leiden. Especially Brummelkamp, it seems, Eglinton tells us, thought it likely that Bavinck was about to return to the theological school and was particularly disappointed when it became clear that Herman intended to carry on his studies in Leiden despite having passed the literary exam in Kampen. So apparently Brummelkamp got his hopes up. He also thought that Jan Bavinck's ongoing support was outrageous. But he didn't get his way. And so Bavinck returned to Leiden for his theological studies. And at this time, 2 things were occupying his mind. One was his theological studies, and the other was a young lady named Amelia. In 1877, he wrote in his diary, "Spoke with Miss Malia. Amelia is my love. I am intoxicated with her." In April of the next year, Bavinck wrote in his diary that he had a hope that Amelia would answer the question posed on September 1 of 1877 with yes. "Oh God, may this happen and grant that no reservations might arise on my part." So notice he's asking for Amelia's hand in marriage. They say that hope springs eternal, and in Bavinck's case, he was hoping against hope that somehow he would win Amelia's hand in marriage yet. He is busy pursuing his studies in Leiden at this point, and in the near future, he will be pursuing also doctoral studies, writing a doctoral dissertation on the ethics of Ulrich Zwingli. And then he will graduate from the University of Leiden, and he will return back to the Afscheiding churches, where he will pursue candidacy. And at the same time, Abraham Kuyper will try to woo him for the first time onto the faculty of the Free University. Next time, we will pick up the life of Herman Bavinck as he graduates from university and as he becomes a pastor in the small town of Franeker.